Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Organization Theory. Our reading load is a little bit lighter this week, and this lecture should be a little bit shorter than we've had in previous weeks as well. So, I'll give you a bit of a break on both of those. Um, Reminders, so week 4, we have our second round of discussion forums in Moodle. One thing I would like to share with all of you is that I thought the first round of discussions in week 2 were outstanding. The level of engagement and the depth of discussion was, I thought, really impressive in all 3 of the groups. So nice work, and I look forward to seeing how the discussion unfolds this week. So our readings this week, we have one chapter out of the Rainey book that is on analyzing the environment of public organizations. This is an important chapter. If we think back to our academia and working with culture book, the environment is one of those roots of culture, and it's really the one that's most complex, most difficult to analyze, most challenging as a leader to have impact on. And so I think this is an important chapter to sort of get a sense of how a leader might be able to work within the environment of the organization that they are leading. Our other readings this week are a couple of theories pieces, one from Adam Smith on the division of labor, and then the other is from Frederick Winslow Taylor, the principles of scientific management. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that because we will talk about those in our discussion, and then also you will be doing your critical outlines of those readings for next week. So let's talk a little bit about the Rainey chapter. There is a table in the chapter that outlines the general environmental conditions, and so I just wanted to just show this on a slide in fairly simple terms. These are the sort of the most basic things that you would want to be looking at as you work with your organizations. What is the technological environment that the organization works within? What are the pressures and the expectations and maybe the external innovations that are going on that are impacting the organization? Legal conditions are, I think, fairly straightforward. Those are the laws, the policies, regulations, court decisions, those sorts of things that have an impact on decision making and operation of the organization. The political conditions, most public organizations are influenced by either executive or legislative branches of government or both. Economic conditions, what's going on in the economy in the area that the organization is working in, and how does that impact the operation? Primarily, you're going to see that economic impact potentially in the clients you serve. It may impact the demand on services based on, unemployment rates and those sorts of things. It also could have a significant impact on an organization's ability to hire and retain qualified employees, depending on whether the economy is doing really well or doing really poorly. The demographic conditions, what's going on in terms of the age of the population, race, ethnicity, those sorts of things. How do those impact the organization? Ecological conditions, so that's the natural environment, climate, those sorts of things. You can see that right now we're, in the Midwest, there are all kinds of severe storms and flooding and those sorts of things. So if you're in an organization that's impacted by dealing with disaster relief or those sorts of things, you can see how the ecological conditions could impact your organization. And then the cultural conditions are not just the culture of the organization, but the broader culture. What are sort of the larger values and beliefs that are driving the work of the organization? And then Rainey talks about one other thing that's not on this list that I think is important to consider in your environmental assessment is the stakeholders for the organization. So, again, looking at who the customers or the clients of the organization are, potentially who are the competitors for that organization, who are partner organizations, who are, are there unions that are are part of the environment. And so those sorts of things also play into the environmental analysis. There is some discussion in this chapter also about contingency theory, which I think is really fascinating. And I wanted to bring this up because I think there's some nice tie-in to previous discussion that we've had about sort of the mechanistic structure of an organization versus more organic organizational structures. And so this contingency theory basically says that organizations have to adapt their structure based on the complexity of their environment. They adopt the structures that are as complex as the environments in which they work or that they confront. And so specifically what it says in the Rainey book is that, if you're in a simple, homogeneous, stable environment, your organization, can be that more mechanistic, hierarchical, centralized structure. But as you get into more complex environments, more unstable environments, to be successful, you have to be more adaptive, more decentralized. Typically, that means you're going to have more departments with, as it says, correspondingly elaborate integrating processes and processes for managing the organization's boundaries and relation with the environment. And so when I was reading this, the best real life example that I could think of was a really fascinating account of our military experience in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade. So General Stanley McChrystal wrote this book called Team of Teams, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World, or as we would say here, a complex environment. General McChrystal was the head of Special Forces operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the interesting things that he talks about in this book was that this culture of the military really had a strain on it in this fight that it was fighting against a network. And so basically that complex environment that was very different than what we'd encountered before as a military forced the military to adopt and to adapt to take on a different sort of a structure. And so, when McChrystal talks about this traditional culture and structure of the military being very much a centralized command and control sort of organization, adapted. I mean, this command of teams in the middle is sort of what was happening with the special forces. I mean, the military had discovered that, the best way for the military to operate was in small, cohesive teams. And so they were working with this command of teams. But even that was not enough. We had the most powerful, well-equipped, well-resourced military on the planet, and we were still unable to deal with this enemy that was not a standing army anymore. It was literally a network that didn't have any centralized command and control. And so the adaptation that McChrystal put in place was really around creating this team of teams, a more adaptive structure. And so here's what he says in the book. We restructured our force from the ground up on the principles of extremely transparent information sharing, what they called shared consciousness, and decentralized decision-making authority, or what they called empowered execution. So as I said, we dissolved the barriers, the walls of our silos and the floors of our hierarchies that had once made us efficient. So what they found was that in this new environment, very, very challenging environment, that the traditional chain of command didn't work because forces on the ground would see a situation, an opportunity, a strategic opportunity, maybe to strike. They would send the request up the chain of command. By the time the okay came back down the chain of command, the opportunity was gone. And so one of the environmental factors that drove this change was realizing that decisions had to be much faster, and that meant they had to be made by people who were on the ground in the moment. And so that's that empowered execution. And basically what I wanted to bring out about this example is that it's really it really ties in with the Kadimian notion of, how do you change culture? One is by addressing the roots of the culture. And so in McChrystal's case, in this particular instance, he really focused on addressing the tasks, and specifically the tasks of decision making and the task of communication. And so that empowered execution was this commitment that we were going to decentralize decision-making authority and give it to people on the ground. But in order to do that, there was another commitment that had to be in place, and that was that everyone in the entire organization had to have a shared consciousness, a shared understanding of what the bigger mission was, what the strategies were. And so that was where he really put in place this extreme transparent information sharing commitment. So one of the ways that he did that was that every day at 5 o'clock Eastern time in the U.S., he would have a massive video conference that would have thousands of people involved in it. And really his role really changed as a leader from being the decision maker at the top to the person in the middle who listened and facilitated and made sure that everyone understood, had that shared consciousness. And so I think that's a really good example, a good lesson in how a culture that has been fairly ingrained for centuries was able to adapt, and they adapted because of the extreme and challenging environmental situation that they found themselves in. So I just want to say a couple things about, as we moved into now talking about theories and getting into some of the classical organization theory. Last week I had you read just an introductory piece about classical organization theory, and I did not address that in my lecture last week. So I just wanted to go back and point out a few of the fundamental tenets that was pointed out in that article. And so one of those about classical organization theory was that organizations exist to accomplish production-related and economic goals. There's one best way to organize for production, and that way can be found through systematic scientific inquiry. So that's the second tenet. Production is maximized through specialization and division of labor. And then finally, people and organizations act in accordance with rational economic principles. And so those were the beliefs or the tenets of classical organization theory. So this week I had you having you read, going far back into the 1770s, a piece from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and that is the piece of the division of labor. One of the things I would say about Adam Smith was that his writing, it came about 15 or so years into the start of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And it was really, it signified a real paradigm shift in economic thinking at the time. And by that, really what Adam Smith was saying was that instead of, when we think of the wealth of nations of being sort of the monetary wealth, how much gold and silver a nation had, wealth was really now a product of how productive a country could be. So the productivity of its organizations, its businesses, its factories, and so on. So that was a big change in economic thought. Then we move forward to the early 1900s, and Frederick Winslow Taylor really built on that division of labor idea and started to apply scientific principles in terms of experimentation and measuring everything, searching for ways to standardize processes, to automate processes, to find that one best way to be the most efficient and the most productive. And so I'm not going to say a whole lot more than that, since we will have an opportunity to have discussion in Moodle this week, and you will also, like I said, be doing some outlines, some critical assessment outlines of these writings and next week's writings as well. So that's it for this week. I look forward to our conversations in the discussion forum, and have a great week.